Three buddies die in a car crash. They go to heaven for orientation. They're all asked, in a few days, when your funeral takes place, your casket will be brought out, your friends and family will look down upon you. What would you like to hear them say? First guy says, I would like them to look down, and I would like to hear them say that this was a great doctor, the doctor of his time, a great family man. Second guy says, I would like to hear from them how wonderful a husband this man was and made a big difference in the lives of many. Third guy says, I would like for them to look down into the casket and hear them say, he's moving. It's a little morbid, I know, but it's true. Nobody wants to die. Nobody wants to die, and yet we all have to die, right? It's not a fun subject, but it's an important subject. It's often said that dying is right below public speaking on the top 10 fears list of fears that we have. It's not true. It's an urban legend. It's a myth. There's all kinds of statistics to say death is higher and more feared than public speaking. But you don't need stats because you have Jerry Seinfeld who said it best. He said, so you mean to tell me that you'd rather be the guy in the casket than the guy public speaking about the guy in the casket? I just don't buy it, and I don't buy it, because death is the number one fear that each and every one of us has. And every once in a while I get one of these tough guys who say, I'm not afraid of death, it doesn't scare me. But I don't think we understand what the fear of death means if we just kind of write it off like I'm not scared. The fear of death isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not something that we can get rid of, maybe until we die. A very important book on this topic was written by Ernest Becker called The Denial of Death. If you haven't read it, it's a must in the field of dealing with dying and death. In it, Becker writes the following: the fear of death must be present behind all our normal functioning in order for the organism to be armed towards self-preservation. It is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. It helps us stay alive as a species, as a race, the human race, as individuals. That fear of death helps us do sometimes, usually, hopefully, smarter things. But the fear of death cannot be present all of the time in one's mind, or else we could not function. He goes on to say, in normal times, we move about without actually believing in our own death. We believe that we're immortal. We are intent on mastering death. A man will say, of course, that he knows he will die someday, but he doesn't care. He is having a good time with living. He doesn't think about death. It doesn't bother him. But this is a purely intellectual, verbal admission. The effect of fear is repressed. No matter what you say, no matter who you are, at some level there is a fear of death, and it isn't a bad thing. It's what takes us out into the world to move forward, to procreate, to achieve, to accomplish. There's nothing wrong with that. It only becomes a problem, this fear of death, when it starts to paralyze us and it starts to inhibit us, particularly from addressing our respective dying and death, because there will come a day when we will die, when we will leave this world. And there is a lot to do between now and then. God willing, you'll live to Admei Esrim until 120 and be well. But whenever that time comes for each of us, there's a lot of preparation that we are failing to undertake. This is one of the number one issues I deal with as a rabbi. And I'm always surprised with it as well, that people aren't prepared for death, or families aren't prepared, because the Jewish people are literate, to say the least, where we love education. 90% of Jews go to college. We're worldly, we're sophisticated, we're savvy, we face life and all that it has to offer. We don't hide from much of anything, except when it comes to dying and death. Invariably, I'll deal with a family, I would say at least half the families I deal with, as many of you know, get the emails from Chayei. I think we had 8 funerals this past month. I would say about half of them were prepared, but the other half had failed to deal with medical directives, end-of-life medical directives. They failed to have their legal affairs in order. Without a will, without power of attorney, it gets really complicated really quickly. And most, which is always surprising to me, most didn't even have burial plots picked out, which cemetery they were going to be buried in. Maybe that was true, but certainly not all of the details, and there are a lot of details when it comes to that time. And they left their loved ones, as often is the case, having to figure out their wishes, having to take care of all of those details. We take, as responsible human beings, we pay our taxes as Americans, we take care of our families. It's a core Jewish value for sure. It's also a core Jewish value to prepare for our death, as difficult as it is. And that's what this week's Torah portion deals with, the mitzvah, the commandment of preparing for death. The Torah portion we read about, which Kira spoke beautifully about, is called Chayei, which is the life of Sarah. But it's ironic because the life of Sarah opens with her death and Abraham responding to Sarah's death. She was 127 years old when she died, and then it says the following, "And Abraham arose from before his dead, and he spoke to the sons of Chayei, saying, I am a stranger and an inhabitant with you. Give me a burial property with you so I might bury my dead before you." It's a pretty radical text. 3,000 years, we've preserved this core spiritual text. Sometimes it deals with the esoteric and the mystical, but I love Judaism because more often than not, it deals with the practical issues of living and, yes, dying. So what does Abraham do at the beginning of this Torah portion? He doesn't just sit in meditation and in prayer. He prepares to take care of Sarah. He creates a eulogy. He buys burial plots. It's a very real conversation. A lot of Jews will say, because of this, Jews don't believe in the afterlife. That is not true. That actually might be true. Judaism believes in the afterlife. Jews, as I always say, will believe whatever they want. Judaism believes unequivocally in the afterlife. The difference is we just don't sit around speculating about it. What my sister does as a psychic medium is kosher within the confines of Jewish law. It isn't that we're against speculating about life after death. It's that we say l'chaim to this life because there's too much to be done in this life to start worrying about what's ahead. We don't have enough time to do all of the important good works in this world before we die. At the very least, we have to take care of our lives, to take care of all of the necessary arrangements before that time comes. And that's what I love about the Torah. Read through, and it is a document of great men and women, yes, engaging prayer and the esoteric and the mystical, but also engaging the practical nitty-gritty of life. Like Abraham in this week's Torah portion, but like Jacob, his grandson, before he dies, leaving a last will and testament to his son Joseph of what he wants to be done with him, where he wants to be buried. You look at, there's many examples of this. Moses, basically the entire last part of the Torah is Moses' last will and testament. He empowers Joshua and the people with what he wants from them, what he sees in them, what they need to do to move forward beyond just mourning and grief, but to fully live life. It's interesting, if you've read the English or you followed along with the Haftarah, today we have a case study in the best of what it means to prepare for our death and the worst. Abraham prepares. Doesn't say he just bought Sarah a burial plot. He buys one for himself and for his children and for his grandchildren. He's thinking forward. David, on the other hand, fails to create a healthy succession plan. And there's turmoil in his house between his sons of who's going to get what and who's going to take the throne. And there is all kinds of heartache and heartbreak that comes in the house of David or in our own houses when we fail to clearly communicate our end. Abraham, it says when he died that he's gathered unto his people, and that the following takes place. And Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him, just like he wanted, in the cave of Machpelah, the burial plot that he chose. And then it says, now it came to pass after Abraham's death that God blessed Isaac. How did God bless Isaac? I think God blessed Isaac by allowing him to move through grief much easier, in a more fluid way, because he didn't have to deal with all of those questions and details of his father's death. His father took care of it for him, and that was a blessing. It's one of the greatest blessings we can give our children or our grandchildren, to face our own death, as difficult and painful as it might be, and to take care of the myriad of issues, and there are a lot of them when it comes to this particular topic. For instance, prearrangements. And I know this isn't fun, but it's important. Our Torah is willing to talk about it. We need to be willing to talk about it, at least today. What do we have to decide before that time comes? In this day and age, we have to decide burial or cremation. Judaism says burial, but oftentimes people want cremation or their family wants cremation. I encourage burial, I push it, but the bottom line is it's our last God-given right to choose how we'll leave this world. It shouldn't be debated after the person is gone. It causes great turmoil when you have to figure out somebody's intention when they're no longer there. Burial plots, I mean, we know we're going to die. Each and every one of us over midlife age should have burial plots. It should not be left to the final end, the final week, to scramble, to call into the office to try and get it all sorted out. We, God willing, have 80 years, 90 years, 120 years in this lifetime. This is something we can think through. It is a gift to think forward, to buy them for ourselves and for our loved ones, and to give that gift to those who come after us. There's a myriad of issues when you go to Goldman's funeral home and you sit with them, all kinds of issues, but it becomes emotional when it's the children or the grandchildren that have to decide. I don't think anybody really wants to spend $5,000 on a casket, right? I think there's a better use of that money to give it to tzedakah, to make a difference in the world. But when you're a child and you're sitting there and you're looking at the Yugo version versus the Mercedes-Benz, nobody wants to feel like they're cheap. And so oftentimes we go with the more expensive casket, but in fact, I know for a fact that most people, I certainly, would rather that money be used for something other than being put into the ground. There's all kinds of issues. I could give you 20 different issues. We're going to have this conversation in the spring, by the way. We've decided that we're going to have a symposium on end-of-life issues and discussions across the board, not just funeral, but legal affairs. We should all have a will. If you have a spouse, if you have a child, I hear my children, right? You are obligated to make sure that you have a will that speaks clearly to what you want, to your desires, to your intentions, to who's going to step in your place, who has power of attorney, who's going to decide. Do you know how many families I've seen ripped apart because power of attorney hasn't been left, and one child has one idea, and another child has another idea, and a small war starts at a time when we shouldn't be dealing with these issues. We should be simply doing the business of mourning and processing our grief. And yes, medical directives, probably one of the most important issues of our day, because today life is complicated and death is complicated, and it's not as simple as it once was. We should appoint a power of attorney. We should have, ahead of time, decided, do we want a DNR, do not resuscitate, or don't we want it? Do we want a ventilator, a breathing machine? Do we want a feeding tube? What's our short-term expectation? What's our long-term expectation? Do we believe in organ donation? Do we not? These are our decisions, not our children's decisions. It's not fair for them to have to decide. But most of all, right, we should want to do this for ourselves. Why? Because in the words of Viktor Frankl, he said this in regards to the concentration camp, but it's true in regards to life. Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, but most of all, to choose one's own way. Fundamentally, therefore, any man, even under such circumstances as facing one's mortality, can decide what will become of him or her. Mentally and spiritually, we retain human dignity when we stand up and we make a choice. We make a choice for ourselves. This is one of the last greatest choices that we have in this lifetime. Ernest Becker says, what is heroism? Heroism is first and foremost a reflex to the terror of death. We admire most the courage in people who face death. We give such valor our highest and most constant adoration. It moves us deeply in our hearts to see someone bravely facing their mortality, facing their death. It isn't that you're fearless in the face of death. As Coach Eddie Rickenbacker once said, what is courage? To feel your fear and move through it anyways. To feel the fear and be fearless in the face of fear. To make our own decisions. To face our mortality. To face our death. Let me end with the words of Reverend Billy Graham. Our days are numbered. One of the primary goals in our lives should be to prepare for that last day. The legacy we leave is not just possessions, but the quality of our lives. What preparations should we be making now? The greatest waste in all of on all the earth, which cannot be recycled or reclaimed, is our waste of time that God has given us to prepare for our last day. As Jews, we don't sit and dwell on death. We don't sit and occupy ourselves with death. We say l'chaim to life, just like Sarah and Abraham did in this week's Torah portion. We say l'chaim by preparing for our death. That's how we fully live our life, and that's how we'll be remembered, not in regards to death, but Chayei Sarah, right, in regards to our life.